Good evening and welcome to this week's edition of Behind Headlines. And in this programme tonight, we shall be discussing the US presidential election that takes place on Tuesday, the 5th of November. In what will be a runoff from the 2020 presidential election between the incumbent, which is Joe Biden, currently residing in the White House, together with former president and presidential candidate for the Republican Party, Donald Trump. And we'll be asking, why is this presidential election so important for Christians, and what are the issues at stake, not only for the freedom of the United States, but also for the free world? And in this program tonight, I'm joined by my good friend, Robert Harris, who I'm officially going to call our American political expert. So, Robert, great to have you on the program.
Nice to be back.
And thank you for joining me. What do you make so far of the US presidential elections? As we know that we're starting to enter that election fever. It's now countdown to Tuesday, the 2nd of November, when the American people will go to the polls to decide who will be their next president. There's not much choice. It's the repeat of the 2020 presidential election. You have Joe Biden, who's currently occupying the White House for the Democrats, or it's the return of Donald Trump as president again. What are your thoughts?
Well, in so many regards, what we're seeing is very unprecedented. I mean, you have a former president who is facing criminal charges on a number of fronts. This is a first in American political history. You have Joe Biden. Donald Trump is 81. Joe Biden is 77. I don't have it against somebody because of their age. You have people in their 80s and 90s who do fantastic jobs in industry. They haven't retired, they march on. But there are concerns about age, certainly as far as Joe Biden is concerned. And it would be interesting to see whether there is actually a presidential televised debate this time round. I suspect that it won't happen because Biden will argue that it's not good to do this with someone who doesn't respect democracy, as he would see it, and Trump doesn't have anything to gain. Well, arguably he might have something to gain because he might actually outsmart Biden in that debate, because Biden, I suspect, would struggle to perform well live in front of the television cameras. But we will see. Of course,
and the big difference, I think, between the presidential election 2024 and the one in 2020 was the fact that the elections not being conducted under the conditions of COVID-19, which made it very, very difficult, particularly for President Trump, to gain re-election, because the Republicans rely on the mass gatherings and the big get-togethers in order to mobilize the Republican votes. And of course, then we had the whole controversy surrounding the mail ballots, and also the role of social media played during that election. So it's going to be a completely different election campaign as we move closer to the important poll date. So just to remind you some of the issues we will be discussing on this program through Behind Headlines. So as I mentioned, the US presidential election takes place on Tuesday, the 5th of November, when the American people go to the polls, not only to decide who will be their next president, but also determines the direction that the free world takes. We see, for example, that the 2024 presidential election will be a repeat of the 2020 US presidential election between President Joe Biden and Republican presidential candidate and former US President Donald Trump. We will also be asking in this program, why does the US presidential election 2024 matter for Christians in the US and around the world, and what are the hot political and moral issues at stake for America and the West? We see, for example, that President Biden, despite his claims that he is a devoted Catholic, and the only second US president to be a Catholic, the former president was JFK, his administration has embraced a very woke and progressive liberal policy agenda that's increasingly hostile to Bible-believing Christians. On foreign policy, we've seen the Biden administration's pursuit for globalism and support for international institutions, as well as at the expense of US sovereignty. Biden and his administration have presided over disastrous US foreign policy initiatives, from the disastrous US military withdrawal from Afghanistan in August of 2021, followed by the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. And we've also seen, for example, his handling of Hamas's mass terrorist attack against Israel on the 7th of October, which has been disastrous failures in terms of US foreign policy. We also see here that while the former US president and Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump is seeking to return to power, the White House, he can only serve a 4-year term in office. So if Trump wins the presidential election, he only has 4 years in office. We see that Trump's character continues to make the headlines and over his divisive and antagonistic behavior, yet he's loved by his Christian evangelical support base, who are part of his core movement known as the MAGA movement, which is Make America Great Again. And we will be asking, why does the US presidential election 2024 matter for Christians? So there is so much at stake in this election. We thought the 2020 presidential elections, there was a lot at stake. And it looked like, if we were looking at this through the lens of January 2020, that President Donald Trump looked set for a certain re-election. The economy was going well. Trump was popular, was leading in the polls, and then of course COVID struck, and it leveled the kind of playing ground. The American economy tanked, as it were. It was very difficult then to get out and vote for the mass Republican rallies, which then favored the Democrats. So the question is, will the Americans put their trust once again in Donald Trump, as he's currently leading in the US polls? Not by much, but can he also mobilize support beyond the MAGA support base? This is the big question.
Well, what happens between now and November? It's 6 months. A huge amount can happen in 6 months. I'm reminded of Harold Wilson, who said famously that a week is a long time in politics. I think today, in the internet age, a day is a long time in politics, not so much a week. So a huge amount can happen. And when you think about, the foreign policy challenges, Ukraine, Iran, Israel, China, domestic issues, there's so much that could shift in another direction between now and November, and it can change some people's minds. So I think it's difficult to predict. However, the polls, fluctuating though they are, some of them certainly, as you say, are indicating that Trump is ahead, but that obviously changes from time to time. So it will be interesting to see how it unfolds over the coming weeks and months.
Absolutely, and of course I think we have to actually make this a very important point, that when Donald Trump was in power, the vast majority of the mainstream media, there wasn't a day, if I give an example for the BBC, I think if you look back at the entire Trump presidency, there probably wasn't a day that the BBC didn't have a negative feature on him. And yet the same level of scrutiny that was applied to Donald Trump is not being applied to Joe Biden. And we have to question his kind of physical fitness as well as his mental ability to be president, which is very much covered up by the mainstream media. They won't ask him tough questions. His press conferences are terrible. He forgets the names and countries of what he's talking about, and he only works 4 hours a day. So surely this actually sets a very dangerous precedent for the free world, that you have a president in office who's not fully engaged with all his faculties, which means who else behind the scenes is in control?
I think it's hugely embarrassing if you're a Democrat to be saying you're going to vote for him, and that's just a factual statement without taking sides here. In a lot of his speeches, he gets countries mixed up, and most people, when they make a mistake, they usually self-correct. They correct themselves. They've said the wrong country or the wrong word, and they correct themselves. He doesn't do that most of the time. And what was perhaps the biggest embarrassment recently was the special counsel report that looked into the whole issue of classified documents being retained. some of the statements in that very, very long report, well, who would have thought they would ever be published? So there was the question of whether, given the potential charges that could be levelled against Joe Biden for retaining those classified documents, which, by the way, go back to his time as a senator, which is quite a long time ago, including his time as vice president under Obama, it was questioned whether he could face a jury and whether the conditions of facing a jury could be met. And the concern that the special prosecutor had was that Joe Biden has a very poor memory. It's hazy, he struggles with his memory, and he was very open about that fact. And he even said, and this of course understandably annoyed Joe Biden, that he couldn't remember the years when he was vice president, he couldn't remember when his son died, and obviously that's a highly sensitive issue, understandably, but not to remember those key milestones in his life was the evidence that was cited by the special prosecutor that this man is struggling with his memory. And therefore, the prospects of facing a jury where they could actually deliver a verdict wouldn't be a fair thing to put him through. So the question is, if he is not fit to stand trial, how can he be fit to be Commander-in-Chief? And I think people on both sides of the political spectrum acknowledge that. So that's a very serious issue that the Democrats have. And yeah, he's decided to stand again. Let's just wait and see what happens over the coming months.
And I have heard, for example, that there could be a prospect where the Democrats have their national convention in August of this year, that they will seek to replace him then with a new presidential candidate that will take Trump by surprise. There's even speculation that they are thinking of Michelle Obama to actually become the Democratic presidential candidate instead of Joe Biden, coming up with medical reasons why he can't stand, despite the fact that he didn't really qualify with the medical standards to actually qualify as president when he actually took office back in January of 2021, let alone this entire period of time that we've had since he's been president, coming up almost a full election cycle. So let's have a look at this excellent CBN report that actually questions Joe Biden's ability to be president now, let alone to be re-elected in November of 2024.
The respected New York Times Siena College poll shows if the election were held today, Biden would lose a general election matchup to former President Trump in these 5 key battleground states. He trails by 11 in Nevada, 6 in Georgia, 5 in Arizona, 4 in Pennsylvania, and 5 in Michigan. Bradley Honan heads a top Democrat polling firm.
I think these are very, very worrying numbers that Democrats have to take very seriously.
Across the board, the numbers are bad. Voters say they trust Trump over Biden on the economy by more than 22 points. 71% say the 80-year-old Biden is too old to be effective, including 54% of Democrats. Only 39% say the same about the 77-year-old Trump. Biden's support is also down quite a bit among Gen Z, Hispanic, and Black voters, all key parts of his base. Top Democrat pollster and strategist Cornell Belcher says all of this is being overblown.
Look, I worked on both of the Obama campaigns. In 2011, it was the same polling that had Obama, down in multiple battleground states, losing to Mitt Romney.
Belcher also points to other factors. Nobody knows quite what the electorate makeup will look like. He adds the positive numbers Trump sees could be as good as it gets, which is good news for Biden.
He's at his ceiling. Biden is at his floor. And I think that is a difference.
Talk now has turned to whether Biden should step down. But what are Democrat insiders saying?
There's a lot of chatter right now in Democratic circles expressing real concern about this polling. I even have people in my ear whispering about whether it's time to dump Biden and find another nominee.
David Axelrod, a key architect of President Obama's White House runs, suggested Biden may want to think of stepping aside, writing the following on social media, quote, "This will send tremors of doubt through the party. Only Joe Biden can make this decision. What he needs to decide is whether that is wise, whether it's in his best interest or the country's. Yes, there also is risk associated with changing course now, But there is a lot of leadership talent in the Democratic Party poised to emerge.
Look, I love David. He's a friend, but I can't believe the statement by David because he knows better.
Belcher says Axelrod knows that campaigns are built to solve problems, and that should be the focus.
You've got to cobble back together and energize these younger, more diverse voters to engage in the process, or you have an electorate that benefits Republicans.
That cobbling back needs to happen soon, or it may be too late. David Brody, CBN News, Washington.
So get ready for election fever as we head closer and closer to that US presidential election poll that takes place on Tuesday, the 5th of November. Now looking, Robert, at this rematch, and The Economist has got a good article entitled Trump v. Biden, Who's Ahead in the Polls? Now, this is a very favourable poll for Biden, unlike the last one we showed from the CBN News report there. It shows that Trump is only 2 points ahead compared to Joe Biden, that has 44 points. But he says here that on November the 5th, Americans will elect their next president. The contest will be feel familiar. The two main candidates were the same as in 2020. Joe Biden, the incumbent, faced no viable competition for the Democratic nomination. His predecessor in office, Donald Trump, easily saw off a crowded field in the Republican primary. This will be the first rematch election in almost 70 years. After Mr. Trump lost the previous election, his supporters tried to overturn the result. He faces federal charges over his alleged participation in the scheme, as well as 3 other criminal cases. His first criminal trial got underway in April. Mr. Biden's presidency has been defined by high inflation, big industrial policy bills, turmoil abroad in Afghanistan, the Ukraine, and the Middle East. Both men are unpopular. The election will be less a popularity contest than a referendum on which a man Americans thinks is the least worst option. And I think that's what it is. I think essentially we're seeing two men here that are effectively at the end of their careers running for the highest office in state. When if we look, for example, the energy that you need and the mental prowess to become president is extreme. And here we got, for example, if Trump is re-elected, he's going to be a president going into his 80s. So very much attacking Joe Biden for being 81. And of course, if Biden lasts a full second term, he's going to be 86. This is just madness, isn't it?
Well, it's interesting observing the schedule of Trump and Biden, both of them together. I mean, Trump he's doing rally after rally, which he loves because he's talking before his supporters who love every word he says. Then he's going into multiple courtrooms, and you can imagine behind the scenes he's constantly engaging in deep discussions with his lawyers about the strategy forward. So I can't imagine any other person who, even someone half his age, to have that energy and that resolve to actually go through all of that because he wants to win. He rejects failure at any cost. And then you've got Joe Biden, who's got the most challenging job in the world, arguably, and physically and certainly mentally in terms of his competence, I think he's struggling hugely with that responsibility. So I think between now and November, I said earlier, there's a lot going on the international front and domestically within America, but also his court cases. It's interesting because when things go the wrong way for him legally in the court cases, that seems to increase his popularity. Let's just go back a few years when Bill Clinton was involved in the scandal with Monica Lewinsky. That didn't actually destroy his support among the Democrats. They still were willing to back him. So when things go wrong for somebody in terms of their private life or things that are alleged that they've done wrongdoing, that doesn't necessarily stand against them. It can actually generate more political capital because people want them in office no matter what.
No, it's very true. And let's find out a little bit more about Joe Biden. This is according to The Economist. So Joe Biden is 81. He will be the oldest ever major party presidential candidate, breaking his own record set in 2020. Mr. Biden won a seat in the Senate at the age of 30 and has held it for over 3 decades. He made failed bids for the presidency in 1998 and in 2008. Served as Barack Obama's vice president, despite a reputation as a centralist Democrat. In office, he has pushed to expand the state and lobbied for unions. He has also led an international coalition to support Ukraine against Russia's invasion. And although he promises to finish the job, if re-elected, many voters think that the job may actually finish him. Now, it's important to discuss their faith background. So I'm just going to go into a little bit of Joe Biden's faith background here. So Biden is the 46th and current president of the United States, ideologically considered a moderate member of the Democrat Party. He is the only second Catholic in American history after JFK in 1960 to occupy the White House. And this is what Trump said on religion. It says, like so many people, my faith has been the bedrock foundation of my life. And this is what Joe Biden said about his own personal faith. He said, like so many people, my faith has been the bedrock foundation of my life. It has provided me with comfort in moments of loss and tragedy. It's kept me grounded and humbled me in times of triumph and joy. Now, the big question we have to ask really, and this is what Catholic Americans will be asking themselves, has Joe Biden been a good Catholic? Considering we look at his kind of voting record, particularly when it comes to the issue of abortion, he flip-flops. One moment he's against abortion, then he's for it, he voted against it, then he voted for it. And it doesn't look like he has that moral guidance that comes from the Bible to actually guide him in his decision making. And he certainly allowed under his leadership the progressive liberal wing of the party to take hold of. I suppose you could argue that he has governed from the center of the Democratic Party with its ideology, rather than actually moved far to the progressive left of the party, as represented by his Vice President Kamala Harris, who he seems to absolutely detest. So share with us your thoughts on will Joe Biden win the Catholic vote?
It depends whether it's the progressive Catholic or the traditional Catholic. I mean, they are almost like different religions, I think we could say that. I don't doubt that he has a deep faith. I mean, he has faced a lot of personal tragedy in his life. He lost his first wife. One of his sons died of a brain tumor. Hunter Biden has had his personal problems with drug addiction and other issues, which unfortunately for the Biden family have become very public. So I don't doubt for a moment that he, prays to God and that it's very sincere. There are views within the Christian world that would say, well, he may say he's a Catholic and he certainly prays, no one denies that. But is he a real Christian? Is he a real Catholic at the end of the day? And there is this raging argument that's been going on for a long time now about communion for Catholics. There is this rule within the canon law of the Catholic Church. I'm not Catholic, by the way, but I've looked into this. And if you're a politician and you endorse abortion, you are not in the right state spiritually to actually receive communion. And there's this long debate within the Catholic Church about this, and Biden, along with a number of other politicians, Nancy Pelosi, there's quite a long list, who are very openly pro-abortion in one way or another, and they receive communion, and the bishops don't get firm on this. They can if they wanted to, but they're too afraid, it's too sensitive to sort of enter into that territory. One or two stand up and take a stand. But the point being, I think, if you're a traditionalist Catholic, and that has many shades to it, you will probably be very concerned about Biden and his claim to be Catholic, because he is on the progressive wing of the party. And as you, I think, suggested with Kamala Harris, who is even more on the left wing of the party, and the politics of his current administration has gone far more left than is perhaps traditional for the Democrat Party. So that's going to concern a lot of evangelicals, not just Catholics. But for those who are of a progressive bent, they will be more than happy, as they are with the current Pope, who is considered to be a liberal across the board.
So let's see this excellent CBN news report that's asking, is Joe Biden a good Catholic?
Millions of Catholics celebrate President Joe Biden, including the Pope and members of his new parish here in Washington, D.C. Still, many question whether he's going against long-held tenets of the faith in favor of a more progressive approach.
Faith is what has gotten me through difficult times in my life. No distinction between the values my mom and dad drilled into us and what I learned from the nuns and priests who educated me.
As the Bible says, weeping may endure for a night, but joy cometh in the morning.
Attending Mass each Sunday, rosary in hand, President Joe Biden has long put his faith front and center.
They applauded for a fellow parishioner, a fellow Catholic.
A position the first Catholic president felt the need to justify 6 decades ago.
I am the Democratic Party's candidate for president, who happens also to be a Catholic.
Unlike JFK, Biden's faith is celebrated by many news outlets, praising his personal devotion along with his liberal views on abortion.
They saw an opportunity to laud Joe Biden for his Catholicism, a Catholicism that they tend to agree with.
The moment of conception is human life and being. But I'm not prepared to say that to other God-fearing, non-God-fearing people that have a different view.
That positive response stands in stark contrast to the outcry over the beliefs of confirmed Supreme Court Justice Amy Coney Barrett, a pro-life Catholic.
What do you think is the most dangerous thing about her? Her religion?
Her advocacy and membership in organizations that are not only against abortion, they're against the most popular forms of birth control.
This different standard infuriates many members of the clergy.
You see a clear bias being lambasted by much of the media because of her deep, devout Catholic Christian faith. Now comes along President Joe Biden. He's not a faithful Catholic Christian.
And many others agree in messages from the pulpits.
You might have heard that the president is Catholic. Perhaps you heard that he went to Mass on Wednesday. I don't care.
You want to celebrate something about this man who is without value, and you don't like it? Well, that's your problem.
I support a woman's right to choose.
Since taking office, Biden is targeting rules that protect the unborn, including the Mexico City policy prohibiting taxpayer funds for abortions abroad, which he previously opposed.
Are you still opposed to public funding for abortion?
I still am opposed to public funding to abortion.
And changing his position on the Hyde Amendment, blocking federal funding for abortion services.
If I believe health care is a right, as I do, I can no longer support an amendment that makes that right dependent on someone's zip code.
In the 80s, Biden voted in favor of a constitutional amendment to allow states to overturn Roe v. Wade, and in the 90s voted against federal funds for abortion at least 50 times. Those stances led to headlines like this as the 2020 presidential campaign got underway.
I am concerned because I think there's an agenda.
So is Archbishop Joseph Naumann, chairman of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. He fears Biden is using his new title and office to confuse the faithful.
The American people have given him a lot of authority and power. But one power he doesn't have is to define what it means to be Catholic.
The president even criticized for using religion to avoid scrutiny of abortion policies, reflecting what some believe is a growing divide in the Catholic Church over his presidency.
You have very fervent liberals and progressives within American Catholicism and very ardent and passionate conservatives in that same movement.
A movement that includes a debate among several Catholic bishops suggesting Biden be denied communion.
Across the board.
As he was on the campaign trail in 2019 by a priest in South Carolina.
If you receive the Eucharist in a state of grave sin, you're doing yourself very grave spiritual harm.
Washington's new Catholic leader says he will not deny him the sacrament.
I've tried to be an agent of reconciliation and harmony from the day that I was ordained a priest.
Some religious observers say the attention on Biden's abortion position overshadows common ground on other key issues.
We also have to remember that there are many Christians who are utterly energized by his stances on things like poverty and immigration.
Meanwhile, despite the church's teachings, a recent survey of U.S. Catholics found more than half think abortion should be legal at all or most cases.
We have an unequivocally pro-choice Catholic in the White House. He represents the majority of Catholics in their position on abortion rights.
Catholic leaders aren't the only ones worried about the trend. Pastor Gary Hamrick says this is a wake-up call for all Christians.
The pulpits have been silent, and therefore the people have not been properly equipped in their faith to recognize that it's not only right to stand up for things that are right and true, but it is necessary for the preservation of a society. If Christians don't take a stand for what is morally right and true, who will?
Biden's Christian critics say the most powerful man in the world should take the lead.
And that CBN News report was certainly very helpful as we kind of discuss how much of a Catholic Joe Biden is, and will he win the traditional Catholic vote in this year's crucial presidential election, which takes place on Tuesday, the 5th of November. I suppose if we look at this in contrast to, for example, the presidential candidate Donald Trump, during his time as presidency would have been from 2017 till he was out of office on the 21st, I think, of January 2021. His appointments of very conservative Supreme judges to the Supreme Court, which then they themselves overturned Roe v. Wade. I think he's the only US president to defend the unborn at the UN. And it's a cause that he has taken up primarily because he knows that this pleases his evangelical Christian support base. But if traditional Catholics are looking to see where they should vote, particularly when it comes to the moral issues of the day, such as the sanctity of life, whether that's at birth or at death, then surely they have to vote Republican under Trump, don't they?
It seems so. Look, I think Biden at best is ambiguous on issues like abortion historically and right up until the current day. Trump, during his 4 years as president, was unambiguously pro-life. There's ample evidence for that. He appointed 3 justices, and he often said and boasted that he appointed 3 pro-life justices. That's part of his legacy, and he's very proud of that. However, since he's been out of office, his position has become rather more ambiguous on abortion. And I suspect there are 2 things going on there. One, Mike Pence is no longer there to influence his thinking. And I strongly suspect Mike Pence had a huge influence on him during their private meetings about agendas such as abortion and all sorts of other issues that are important to his supporters. But also, at the moment, given that Roe v. Wade was overturned in the Dobbs case, it's still a hugely sensitive and concerning issue for people on both sides of the political spectrum. So he is concerned that he's going to lose support from people who might be a little bit on the fence about abortion. So in one of his recent speeches on his own channel, his own social media platform, Truth Social, just over 4 minutes, he spoke about a number of things relating to abortion, and he said it's about the will of the people, and that he's not supporting the federal ban should it ever come to his desk if he becomes president again. However, he sees it in terms of the states, each state having the freedom to choose whether they ban it or allow it. Let's just think about this for a few moments, because there are almost 24 states at the moment, as we speak, that have either banned abortion or have limited access to it. And that was predictable, that you're going to have the country divided. So the abortion issue is definitely a major part of the discourse in this debate, as it is in, most of the presidential debates in recent decades has featured abortion in one form or another, but especially now that Roe v. Wade, after being the law for 49 years, was overturned.
How much is this down to kind of electoral strategy? Because we saw in the midterm elections in November of 22, for example, when we know that Roe v. Wade was overturned by the Supreme Court, and then it went down to the state level to decide whether they want to implement abortion or not. We saw that this mobilized the Democratic support base, which enabled Biden to still maintain control and the Democrats control of the Senate. They lost Congress, but they still maintained control of the Senate when it looked like they were going to lose both houses of Congress. So isn't there a danger that Trump is possibly seeing that he feels like he already has that evangelical Christian support base going into the election who faithfully supported him during his first presidential election bid, and that if he then campaigns strongly on a kind of pro-choice or pro-life stance, then this will just mobilize the Democrats who are feeling a little bit apathetic under Joe Biden's leadership. They don't feel that he represents the progressive liberal wing of the Democrat Party, and therefore they will come out and vote for Biden en masse. And I think this is part of the calculations that Trump is probably working through right now. But the question is, if he wins the presidency, what does he do then? Does he become a kind of pro-life president again? Or as you say, and this is, I think, one of the missing discussions when it comes to the US presidential elections, looking at Trump's previous term in office, was the contribution that his vice president, Mike Pence, made whilst in office to many of the pro-Christian legislative program that the Trump administration pushed out, including support for Israel, stems from Mike Pence.
I think there's a lot of truth in that. I think it all depends, or largely depends, on who he chooses as his vice presidential running mate.
Absolutely.
And what potential influence he or she will have on Trump. But, you know, a huge amount, as I said earlier, can happen between now and November. And I think Trump is reading the times. He's reading the times in terms of the polls. I don't think abortion is something he feels strongly about in an intrinsic kind of conviction-based way, although he does feel strongly about very late-term abortions, and I think that expression of belief is very genuine. But look, I think recently his more ambiguous stance on abortion, it has angered the more Bible-believing groups of Christians, both Catholic and Protestant, but those who are happy with Trump but maybe are a little ambiguous on when abortion should be allowed, they're very happy to hear this more, sitting on the fence stance. So while he might potentially lose some support among his base, he might also gain some support, as I say, from those who are not so fixed and uncompromising on that issue.
Absolutely, and we know what God's stance is on this one. So if he wants God's blessing on his campaign, then he knows where he needs to stand on that issue. Now, according to Donald Trump, and this is according to the Economist, Donald Trump's extraordinary campaign follows his less than remarkable term as America's 45th president. I would argue differently. I think he achieved many things in his presidency and probably was one of the most successful presidencies since the Reagan era in the 80s. He says, which concluded shortly after his supporters staged an armed attack on the Capitol. His alleged role in instigating the attack and a broader effort to overturn the results of the 2020 election result into two criminal indictments. In the federal court and the Georgia state, he faces two others, totaling 91 felony charges. Says the 77-year-old denies all wrongdoing. Mr. Trump is a self-proclaimed billionaire who made and lost much of his money in real estate before he became a reality TV star. This time his campaign pairs familiar culture war issues, building a border wall, a left-wing agenda insanity with fresh grievances against his lawyers prosecuting his cases and the judges overseeing them. On terms of religion, Trump is the former US president. He's age 77. On religion, he is a raised Presbyterian, now calls himself a non-denominational Christian. And this is what he says. He says, I grew up going to church with my family in New York City. My parents taught me the importance of faith and prayer for a young age. Though I was confirmed a Presbyterian church as a child, I now consider myself a non-denominational Christian. So we see, for example, that Trump wants to play that Christian card. He realizes his core supporters, his most faithful supporters, are evangelical Christians who support his MAGA movement, which is Make America Great Again. We see, for example, his last term in office was very much had strong Christian influences with his faith foundation, allowing Christians to come in to pray. He set up a task force to deal with the persecution of Christians around the world from in the State Department when Mike Pompeo was Secretary of State. We've seen that he's been incredibly a strong supporter of Israel and did enough to confront the enemies of Israel. And you've got to argue that his time in office, not only did America go through a kind of unprecedented economic growth and prosperity, but he also made the world a safer place because of his unpredictability and the fact that the Iranian regime was on its knees. Hezbollah and Hamas were complaining that they were running out of money. ISIS was defeated in Iraq and Syria. And now since Biden's disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan in August of 2021, we see a revival in ISIS, with ISIS-K being based in Afghanistan, preparing to launch attacks not only against Moscow, as we saw a couple of months ago, but also now against, for example, Europe and Western targets. So the world has become, without doubt, a more dangerous place under the presidency of Joe Biden.
I think it has. There's a lot to this. I mean, on the one hand, his critics, Trump's critics will say, he is destabilizing NATO, which provides security for the whole of Europe and North America. This is terrible. Well, it is terrible that he makes certain inflammatory statements that haven't been carefully thought through about pulling the plug on those countries that are not paying their dues. At the same time, it's deeply irresponsible that countries aren't paying their 2% into their defences. This should not be an issue. They should be paying their 2%. And even since Ukraine was invaded by Russia, some of them are still not paying their dues. What is going on? So I think he's got a point there, and he did, I think, trigger people into thinking, okay, we need to take this NATO thing seriously. This is not just a joke. This is not just a historical relic. It means something very real for the contemporary world. You mentioned a number of issues about Afghanistan and Israel. I think the current president doesn't give an image of strength to the world. I think that's putting it very mildly. And I think Trump, yes, he's bombastic. He doesn't understand tact when it's needed. He doesn't do nuance when it's needed. I think when he's speaking to those who agree with him, he's actually very calm and measured. But when he's up against his opponents and something has irritated him, he does obviously explode very easily. And I don't think this is very good on the international stage.
What I think I've realised, if you look at the Biden administrations, the biggest mistake that the Biden administration has made in terms of US foreign policy is that they fail to realise that what gives America its strength and its role as the world's policeman is that you back up diplomacy with force. They don't believe in that. They believe in international reconciliation, international agreements, negotiations, not realizing that America's power relies on its military might, and that if you back up American diplomacy with military power and might, then that is how you kind of dominate and you solve conflicts around the world, that threat of force when needed, particularly if we talk about the Iranian nuclear project and Iran's sponsorship for international terrorism, Russian aggression against the Ukraine, or Chinese aggression against Taiwan. We know that these are totalitarian regimes, and the only way that you stand up to them is with a threat of force. And we see that the Trump administration and Antony Blinken, his Secretary of State, don't actually believe in military force or using America's power as leverage in diplomacy. And this is why the world has become an increasingly dangerous place. And if we take, for example, Trump's administration when he was in office, with the assassination of the Iranian general Khulosami, we see then, for example, the Iranians threatened total revenge for the assassination of one of their generals. And the warning came out from the White House that if you carry out any form of retribution, we have 52 military targets, each one for all the American hostages that were taken prisoner in when the Islamic Revolution occurred in Iran in 1979, and we will target Iran and those 52 military targets if you retaliate. So we can see a different type of rhetorics. We can see the deployment of diplomacy with that balance of force. And we also see that the only military adventurism that Trump ever deployed during his time in office was to encourage the Iraqi army and others, and also the Turks, to take on and destroy ISIS. So we didn't see many American troops on the ground. We didn't see any American military intervention around the world.
Well, there were no new wars under Trump, even though people thought that, his critics said, oh, it's all going to be awful, the whole world's going to be threatened. I just want to offer a few thoughts on Iran. The Iran nuclear deal, 2015, Barack Obama. Trump regularly calls it the worst deal by any American president. There's something in that, I think, because Iran is not just an existential threat to Israel, which it is. It wants to wipe it off the map. It's been very open about that. It's a threat to the region of the entire Middle East, and I would argue, and I'm not alone in saying this, it's a threat to world peace, world security, global security. So just think about that Iran deal for the moment. Trump withdrew from it in 2018, and under the Biden administration, Biden has actually signed off the release of billions of dollars to Iran so that they can pay off other state actors. Now, the Republicans claim that actually this money can't go to wrong stuff like bomb making or nuclear facilities. It can only go to the target, a civilian, partner. But who can say?
Yeah, you can't scrutinize it.
We can't prove where it's going. But regardless of where it's going and how it's being used, it's actually emboldening Iran. And let's just remind ourselves that Hezbollah, Hamas, are the proxies, among others, of Iran. And Trump claims, and I wouldn't go so far as this, he says that October the 7th wouldn't have happened. I think it's more complex than that. It's difficult to reach such a conclusion. However, it is emboldening Iran, and this is giving the wrong message to a state that is effectively a terrorist state. Henry Kissinger once said that Iran needs to decide whether it wants to be a country or a cause. And I think today the same is true. It doesn't want to play the rules of the international order. More than that, it wants to wipe out another country, within the region of the Middle East. You can't allow a country like that to continue operating in the way it does. And Biden is not really displaying the authority that you would expect of a world leader to actually show Iran who is in charge. And they must privately be laughing at the Biden administration. And I think we should all be worried about that.
Yeah, it's a policy of appeasement. And we've seen what happens when Western nations adopt a policy of appeasement. We saw that in the 1930s that led to the Second World War, the rise of fascism and Nazism across Europe. And of course, today, the Iranian regime is influenced by that kind of Nazi, Islamist, fascist ideology and supremacy that wants to destroy the world. I mean, the facts are now that we even have the UN's own nuclear watchdog saying how that the Iranian regime is in breach of the Iran deal that was made, in which the regime received billions in sanctions relief. But we've also seen, bizarrely, the continuation of Barack Obama's policy towards Iran, and that was to empower Iran as America's key asset in the Middle East. Because they are the strong horse, we're going to back and support the Iranian regime against the more traditional allies in the Middle East, which is Israel and Saudi Arabia. And this is what Trump did, which also then we saw a de-escalation of conflict, a de-escalation of terrorism. And when we see that Biden came into power in January of 2020, we've seen a complete reversal of all of President Trump's domestic and foreign policy issues, with huge consequences for the Middle East. And you can I certainly agree with Donald Trump, because he was implementing the normalization across the Middle East through the Abraham Accords. The Saudis were about to sign a peace treaty with Israel, and the Middle East was about to enter into a new era of peace and prosperity, but that has been completely destroyed by Biden's administration, bringing the Palestinians back into the cold so they can continue their support for the destruction of the State of Israel, receiving US money, aid, diplomatic immunity that has perpetuated this conflict. So let's have a look at this excellent CBN News report that talks about how Israel could be the deciding factor in this year's presidential election come Tuesday, the 5th of November.
Navigating how he handles the war in Israel is getting tougher for Joe Biden, not only as president, but also in his quest to win re-election. A consistent outcry by his party's progressive wing is getting louder and larger, pushing for action against Israel for what they call a genocide in Gaza. Following the recent tragedy involving aid workers, the Biden administration took a stronger tone, calling on Israel to take concrete steps to end the humanitarian suffering, or else.
If there's no changes to their policy and their approaches, then there's going to have to be changes to ours.
The question of how far those changes go is key, because Biden is trailing in the polls. A drastic shift against Israel could further fracture the Democrats' base, putting key swing states at risk in November. For example, the number of Democrats choosing uncommitted over Biden in key swing state primaries has been jarring. It began in February with Michigan at roughly 13%, then almost 19% in Minnesota. This month, 8% in Wisconsin. Rick Klein is political director for ABC News.
He needs Michigan. And I tell you what, at the this election seems, at least in those Rust Belt states, they're going to be one at the margins.
Yeah, I think that's right, David. And look, Michigan is a little less close than some of the other battleground states, 150,000 votes or so. But more than, almost more than 100,000 people voted uncommitted in the primary. So if a big chunk of them decide to stay home or vote Donald Trump, then you start to see a real difference. Joe Biden really can't become president if he doesn't win Michigan.
Later this month comes Pennsylvania, which has the country's fourth largest Jewish population. Middle East analyst Jake Novak spent time as media director for the Israel consulate in New York.
If there's any state in the country where the Jewish vote actually means something, it's Pennsylvania.
Since it has about 3% of the voting population, Biden will need to perform a political tap dance between progressives and Jewish Democrats in Pennsylvania and similar states.
The biggest problem is that he's trying to dance at two weddings. That's an old Yiddish phrase. And you can't do that.
On the Republican side, Donald Trump is also weighing in. As president, he took a strong pro-Israel stance throughout his term, although recent comments about quickly ending the war have raised eyebrows.
So it'll be interesting to see how Israel's war against Hamas in Gaza could have a huge impact on this year's presidential election. It does impact the Democrats more than the Republican Party, because traditionally we've seen that the Republican Party and its supporters are pretty much strong supporters of the Jewish state and Israel. But we also see, for example, how the issue of Israel and not pressuring Israel to actually push through and call for a ceasefire in its war against Hamas in Gaza is angering the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. So could we see come November that the progressive liberal wing of the Democrat Party end up not voting or supporting Biden?
I've been thinking about that. You also have independent parties as well, and it would be interesting if there are new precedents set in terms of more people voting for the independent parties. We have to wait and see. I think this is a hugely, uncharted territory that we're actually facing with Israel and Gaza, the only functioning democracy in the Middle East, and it's a highly, highly sensitive issue in American politics.
I mean, one thing we haven't really touched on, because we haven't really had time really, is the progressive liberal agenda of the Biden administration and how Christians in America are feeling increasingly politically marginalized in American society under the Biden administration. Of course, they trust Trump because they believe that Donald Trump has their best interests at heart. They look at his previous presidential record when it comes to Christians, and we know that Trump has said that he will actually defend the cross. Does this mean that he will be a better president protecting Christian interests rather than the Catholic Joe Biden?
It seems on balance that he will be, even though ideologically he may be an old-fashioned liberal on certain issues to do with identity politics, but I think he knows where his supporters are on these issues when it comes to freedom of speech, religious liberty, identity politics.
Robert, you've done a great job on Behind Headlines. Absolute pleasure to have you on the programme today. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching this programme at home. We know as the American people go to the polls on Tuesday, the 5th of November, not only does this decide the future of the United States, but it decides the future of the free world. And this is why this year's presidential election matters so much for Christians. So thank you for watching this week's edition of Behind the Headlines.